This is my Sir Gwyn Hero of Ashfield deck. It is an Equipment Matters deck. Sir Gwyn costs 3 and Mardu for a 5/5 with Vigilance and Menace. And she says, whenever you equip creature you control attacks, you draw a card and lose a life. And equipment you control have equipped Knight 0. One of the biggest problems with equipment is that it can be very, very mana intensive to both cast the equipment and have creatures on board and equip the equipment, only to have your equipped creature die and have to start over next turn. And this can be a loop that if it happens in 2 or 3 turns in a row, you have no chance of winning. And Sir Gwyn gets around one of the biggest hurdles, and that's having to pay the equip cost, as well as being a very flavorful commander. And Vigilance and Menace are very, very important keywords that you would want to get your equipped creatures to have them have anyways. So she answers a lot of the questions you have. She does cost 6 mana in Mardu, and normally I try to steer away from commanders that cost 6 mana or more that are not in green, just because it's so hard to get there in a timely fashion. And as a result, I have no choice but to overextend into mana rocks in order to be able to cast her. Ideally, as early as turn 4. However, I have so much interaction that I can normally slow the game down until I can cast Sir Gwyn in a timely fashion. And then, hopefully, I can start offing players in under 2 swings per player. And with all the lifelink and other options, just another way to further extend the game. And so first we'll go to my other creatures. She has the equipped Knight 0, so I do actually play other knights. And we'll start with Armored Sky Hunter. Armored Sky Hunter is a 4-drop for 3/3. 3 power, 3 toughness, flying. It says whenever it attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you can put an aura or an equipment from among them onto the battlefield this way, and you can attach the creature you control. Put the rest of those cards in the bottom of the library in a random order. I don't have any auras in this deck, so really the only opportunity I would have to hit would be one of my 19 separate equipment cards. I do run a lot of the Swords of, and they do provide protection, which means that auras will either not be able to be targeting or fall off if they're already attached. So that's a bit of a nombo that I've tried to avoid by not including any auras, even though this is a true Voltron deck. Next we have Balan, Wandering Knight. Balan is just an alternative legendary Equipment Matters creature that has a whole separate way to get around the equipment cost. And it's good to have other creatures that can suit up and in the game if something's happened to my Sir Gwyn. And also happens to be a knight. Next we have Kinsbill Cavalier. Kinsbill Cavalier doesn't really care about equipment. It doesn't really do anything for such. But if any of my equipped knights are ready to be in attack mode, it does give them double strike, and it doesn't target them, so it doesn't actually. It's not a nombo with my Swords of. And also a knight. Next we have Knight Exemplar. It gives all my knights +1/+1 and indestructible, and also has first strike. Of course, being a 2/2 with first strike, I don't normally care about Knights Exemplar's attack prowess. It's really just the indestructible. Giving a non-targeting indestructible to possibly more than one of my creatures, as well as being a very flavorful knight of her, on her own. Although she doesn't protect herself because it does say other knight. It does make my Sir Gwyn, and as well as any of my other relevant knights, much harder to kill, because indestructible is one of the top 2 or 3 keywords that we would like to add with our equipment anyways. And so this provides it in a non-equipment form. Next knight we have is my Phyrexian Crusader. Phyrexian Crusader kind of fills the role of the Balan. It's just another knight that I can suit up. And this one only requires really 10 power. It's already got first strike and protection from red and white, which does make it unblockable every now and then. If the opponent is playing Boros or a mono white or mono red, or just happens to have only those types of creatures out, then I can swing in for 10 effect and end the game. This sometimes does enable me to have a giant Sir Gwyn and a just slightly above average Phyrexian Crusader, and to pressure 2 separate opponents without having to overextend all of my equipment on 2 separate creatures and spread it out too much. And the last knight that the deck plays is Pure Steel Paladin, a true must-have in all of my Equipment Matters decks. It both draws me cards and makes my equip cost 0 for if I control 3 or 4 more artifacts. Because I have 19 separate equipment as well as lots of mana rocks, hitting 3 equipment is almost a guarantee by turn 5 or 6 or so. And so that is just another Sir Gwyn, assuming Sir Gwyn's not there to do the same effect. And the drawing cards also helps me have some card velocity, because this deck is so mana hungry that it's nice to have card velocity, even just to hit mana or my land drops, or for any other reasons, or to find answers for things. Although I do play a lot, you have to get to them. And then lastly, we have my only two non-night creatures in the deck, and that's Heavenly Blade Master. Heavenly Blade Master is in the deck because yet another creature that can use these equipment to their full effect. And the synergy is just too good. And I like this card. I didn't really have another home for it. And I wish that all of my creatures were knights. However, truly, this is a true sub-theme. And Sir Gwyn is really a Voltron deck with a small knight sub-theme. And of course, Stoneforge Mystic is just a classic equipment card. Let me search for the most relevant one at the time. Often, it's good to go get Sword of Feast and Famine, which is in the deck, because it does allow me to untap my lands and play even more additional spells. Or if there are other keywords such as Indestructible or Hexproof or Haste that I need to enable my Sir Gwyn with, she does allow me to do that as well. And nextly, we'll go to my artifacts. Start out, like most of my decks that have any color at all, Soul Ring and Arcane Signet are the very first two that you think of. They're just the two best ramps artifacts that you have in the game that don't cost $100. And so when I have an opportunity to play them, I do. And there are other art includes. There's things that get included in the deck before I even start deck building them. Most I just go and put in cards in a deck box, and I go my Arcane Signet and my Soul Ring. Next, we have a trio of signets. These are all of the relevant colored signets that I have for the deck. Boros, Orzhov, and Rakdos Signet. Signets, any ramp that's in 2 mana is at the peak of effectiveness, and having to use artifacts is sort of a evil necessity when we're in non-green. However, if we're going to have to overextend into artifacts, signets are just a fantastic way to go, and they're classic non-green ramp for a reason. Next, we have 2 more 2-drops. These are just sort of my bastardized signets. It's Felwar Stone and Mind Stone. Of course, Felwar Stone color fixes some. Mind Stone also can give out a pinch if I need to draw just that one more card for the saving last minute. Let's see what I can get myself out of this jam sort of situation. But it's just more importantly there for a 2 mana. Immediately taps for a mana and replaces. So that 2 mana ramp is very, very important. Next, we have Chromatic Lantern. This deck is not as mana pip hungry as some of my decks. It does require a lot of mana, but it generally is fine with all that mana being colorless. However, there is a few occasions where I'd like to double spell, and on those occasions, having 3 black or 3 red or whatever can come into play. And this card may eventually come out. There have been the Liquid Metal Coating just came out, which is another 2-drop artifact that taps and has other abilities. So that might replace this one eventually. But every time I see this in this deck, I normally seem to need the mana. So until that stops being a thing, despite my very effective mana base, this will keep a home in the deck. Next, we have another pet card of mine. It's the Immortal Sun. With this one deck, this +1/+1 can actually have an effect, especially if you have Double Strike or damage doublers. Immortal Sun's +1/+1 can be more effective than just the +1/+1. But the most important one on this card, generally in all the decks it's in, is the cost reducer, letting me double and triple spell on turns I wouldn't otherwise be able to do so. And the additional card draw in Mardu can really come into play because Mardu needs all the help it can get being able to double spell. Or to draw cards, I mean. And then nextly we have my enchantments. And we'll start out with Footfall Crater. Footfall Crater is a red card, which means that it's sort of it would be a non-bow with the Swords of that have protection from red. However, it makes the land actually have the ability, and it does not have the ability to give Trample and Haste itself. Trample and Haste, both very important keywords, and I tried to find more sources for Haste, including equipment that had it, while not relying on Lightning Greaves, since it does make my equipment not be able to be attached if I only have the one creature. So because I don't have access to Lightning Greaves, because I choose not to play it because I don't think it's very good in this deck, and so it gives me another option for haste besides Swiftfoot Boots. And it can be cycled, which that doesn't normally kind of play. And then next we have Phyrexian Arena. This card is... really, I just had one. It can draw cards over the long game, and this deck does often drag the game out until 8 or 10 turns later. And so hopefully I can play this turn 2 or turn 3, well, realistically turn 3, and maybe draw 5 or 6 cards from it. This card will eventually come out because I think it's less effective than it used to be, and I don't actually care about the double black for any sort of devotion spells or things like that like I would in other decks. At the time, it was a card draw spell that I had, and I could see this coming out at some point. But for now, any card that lets me draw cards gets me further and further into all the other cards I need. So I don't have an automatically better answer for it yet. Next, we have Smothering Tithe. Because this deck is so mana hungry, and because Smothering Tithe is just an all-time great card, there's no reason to defend this as part of the option. It's just an auto-include along with the Arcane Signet and Soul Ring. If you're in the colors, and if it's applicable, and if you have one, it goes in the deck. It's just the way it is. And then last equipment here, or enchantment I should say, is my Sigarda's Aid. It lets me cast my equipment at instant speed, and that means I can normally dodge some of the more, I can dodge some removal that people don't, because they don't answer threats they can't see, and they always want to be mana efficient. So hopefully this can avoid my sort of Feast and Famine or whatever getting removed. It let me swing to at least one turn. Sometimes some of these equipments are so powerful, if I can swing to them at least one time, that can be enough to get me buy me a few more turns and let me get further into the game. And then it also says if an equipment enters the battlefield, I can attach it to a target creature I control. Yet another redundant ability for Sir Gwyn's free equip. Good for any equipment deck. And then next we'll go to my instant speed spells. This is where I have a very large package for removal, starting with Anguish Unmaking, Despark, and Dispatch. A Dispatch does have a clause on it that says I need to have Metalcraft, which is 3 more artifacts on the battlefield. This deck has got about 30 or something artifacts in it, so that is not ever a problem. So 1 mana instant speed exile a creature just makes it a redundant effect with Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile. And Despark has a contingent clause that says it can't hit things that have smaller than 4 converted mana cost. But the really big scary stuff, it does answer, and it answers anything as long as they have that meet that 1 requirement. Anguish Unmaking is just the best removal spell in Commander. And the 3 damage that it does me, the 3 life lost, doesn't matter because I have a fair amount of life gaining options in my deck. Nextly, we have the aforementioned Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, and Generous Gift included. And these are just 3 more spells that are... The Generous Gift is just very, very versatile, whereas Path to Exiles are super mana efficient. 1 mana, exile a creature. There's occasionally creatures that can completely get in my way and shut down my game plan. Opponents' Gisellas or any giant 8-drop creatures can present a faster clock than I'm presenting, and I need to get rid of them as soon as possible. Next, we have Boros Charm. Boros Charm does double duty. I can give one of my creatures Double Strike, which is the first relevant line of text. And the second one is that I can give my permanents indestructible until the end of turn. And if you're ever facing a artifact board wipe, this can be the only thing that really saves me, except for Teferi's Protection. Teferi's Protection is just another thing for me to protect myself. The biggest thing I'm worried about with this deck is overplaying my hand with my equipment and then having them all destroyed in one go, and that makes it really, really difficult to rebuild. And then the last instant we have in the deck is Enlightened Tutor. Enlightened Tutor lets me go find my Smothering Tithe, or one of my card draw spells, or one of my choice equipments. It's just better than some of the only targets equipment tutors because it lets me hit any of my stuff, but especially Smothering Tithe it tends to be the most common target for this card in whatever deck it's in, because if it's in a deck, it automatically means that that deck includes white, and Smothering Tithe is just a broken card that is never the wrong answer, unless you have something about to kill you right away. This will 2 more tutors. This is Scheming Symmetry and Demonic Tutor. Scheming Symmetry can be kind of dangerous if you're playing a very narrow strategy because it does enable your opponent to be able to get the exact thing that's going to hurt you. But we hope that we play this early enough, or that we play somebody that hasn't built their deck and don't think about that in such a way. They're just trying to advance their own game plan. Because if they're just trying to advance their own game plan, there's a good chance that my game plan will beat theirs. The Demonic Tutor is just the most efficient. It's just the best tutor in the game. Next we have my last tutor. This is Steel Shaper's Gift. 1 mana sorcery speed to search up an equipment and put that card in my hand. This is like I said, often to go get sort of Feast and Famine, or maybe one of my equipments that makes my creatures indestructible. Next, we have some card draw spells, starting with Painful Truths, Read the Bones, and Wheel of Fortune. Painful Truths, and because I'm in Mardu, I can pay 3 separate colored mana, red, white, and black, draw 3 cards and lose 3 life. In this deck, life lost is, like I said, it's not important. Much like Read the Bones making me lose life, because I have so many ways to gain more life later on, I can make up for the fact. So I'm really just looking to try to draw as many cards as possible without putting myself in such a dangerous position like I would if I were, paying all of my life into a Necropotence. Besides, I don't really like to play that card. I tried to not. Then we have Wheel of Fortune. Wheel of Fortune, because sometimes I can vomit my hand out, Wheel of Fortune enables me to pull, completely refill my hand. And it's very important because I cannot miss land drops in this deck because Sir Gwyn does cost 6 mana, and that is not a small amount in non-green. And then lastly, we have 6 board wipes, starting with Blasphemous Act. Just probably the top 3 board wiping commander because it so often only costs 1 mana and dealing 13 damage, kills generally every single creature I would ever want to kill. However, because my Sir Gwyn often has a protection from red, it sometimes will just skate around my Sir Gwyn, killing everything else, allowing her to attack openly. And that is sort of a consistent theme with my other board wipes. A lot of them, at least, is things that allow me to keep Sir Gwyn while destroying as many of my opponent's threats as possible. Which is why I really like this brand new card, Promise of Loyalty. Each player puts a vow counter on a creature they control and sacrifices the rest. So this sacrifice does get around Hexproof and Indestructible and Shroud, and so it's really, really powerful. So ideally, they'll have no choice but to put the loyalty counter on. And if it's a creature that just has a really good ability and is not trying to attack me, then this is sort of a bad board wipe. But generally, it just keeps me from being attacked. So it's almost like a life gain card, very Fumigate-esque. But this one doesn't make me kill my Sir Gwyn, so that's very important. And last one we have that doesn't touch my stuff, or not the last one, but the next one we have that doesn't touch my stuff is Single Combat. So each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control and then sacrifice the rest. Just another forced sacrifice. It's always good to get rid of those hexproof and indestructible creatures, like I said. And every time I can kill everything, or most things, and save Sir Gwyn, my Sir Gwyn's going to usually single-handedly be better than anything else. And then nextly we have Ruinous Ultimatums. This is destroy all non-land permanents your opponent's control. This card ends the game. It just ends the game. If it doesn't get countered, the game is over. It's almost too good. And the casting cost looks like some drawback, but it's just not. I've got enough. I've Fellwar Stone and my signets and everything, so casting the double green, or the double red, double black, triple white is not even a chore. I can usually do this really consistently. As soon as I can make 7 mana of any sort, with the exception of sometimes when I have Soul Ring, I can usually cast this. And then the game, if they've extended it all, if they're not playing some weird 2-card combo deck or something, the game's over. And the card is actually almost unfun because it's so effective. And then lastly, we have Merciless Eviction. It lets me exile all artifacts, or exile all creatures, or exile all enchantments, or exile all planeswalkers. This card is, because it's mass, non-targeting, exiling removal, this card seems like more than any other card, other than perhaps Terminus, is the card that people are like, you know what, this situation is unanswerable unless I go get my insert card here. And usually what they're thinking of is Merciless Eviction, just because it gets around absolutely everything. It's not quite... it's not quite as good necessarily as making them sacrifice, but it gets rid of these things permanently because they are exiled. I've often had the exile all enchantments come into play when somebody's gone really, really wide with like a Tuvasa deck. But usually this hits my opponent's creatures, or everyone's creatures, really. And next, we'll save the equipments for last, so we'll go to my lands package. And this deck is running a pretty basic, consistent lands package with my other decks. And that is 2 mountains, 2 swamps, and 2 plains. I really, really want to hit... I play a fair amount of colorless lands. And because I do, I try not to play too many basic lands. So the first one is Vault of the Archangel, and it lets me pay for creatures I control gain Death Touch and Lifelink. So this is one of the first ways that I have so far to make my creature have Lifelink. Then we have Rogue's Passage, which makes my creature unblockable, which is Sir Gwyn. These are none of my equipment gives Shroud, so these don't have color identity, so they can really get around. No matter what combination of cards I have in the field, these can affect my creature. And then I have target creature gets +2/+0 and gains Vigilance and Haste until the end of turn. That's the first way that I have to give my creature haste. And then Sunhome Fortress of the Legion gives target creature double strike until the end of turn. So making my creature unblockable and double strike for 8 mana or whatever combination it would end up being. It's just, we really want to kill people on one hit. And if we can do it one hit, then that's crazy effective. And then the last colorless spell, brand new or colorless land, is my Witch's Oven. The Witch's Oven gives my target commander lifelink. Lifelink is so important because it buys me turns. And this deck is going to take 5 to 7 turns swinging to kill all of my opponents if I have 3 opponents. And, that is a really, really tough uphill climb to try to swing that many times with the 6 mana creature to resolve. When you're playing Voltron, you're automatically putting yourself in a position of saying, I'm low to my chances to win this game because I put so much stock on my commander. And you really just have to love the idea that when it works, it's going to be so much fun that it's going to be worth it. And the only thing you can really do is hedge all your bets and double down on all the effects that you think are going to get you there. And Lifelink is one of those effects that draws the game out and gives me more and more turns to swing as many times as possible with Sir Gwyn. And then the first land that casts for a color but also has an ability on it is my Shizo Death Storehouse. This says target legendary creature gains fear until the end of turn. It means only artifacts or black creatures, or I guess in this case black, white, or red creatures can, or black or artifact creatures, yes, black artifact creatures can block it. It makes it harder to block my creature, and every form that of even almost unblockable is helpful. Next we've got two of my Modern Horizons lands, my Horizon lands. Paying 1 and sacrificing them to draw a card can get me out of a pinch late game if my grip is filled with cards that aren't going to be good for the current moment. And it's just nice in colors that don't really draw cards very well, which Mardu is definitely in that category. These cards help me out late game if that comes into play. And I don't have the red-black one yet, the Rakdos one yet, because it hasn't been printed. If it does, though, it'll probably go in the deck. And next we've got 3 crew lands. I really like these for 3-color decks. They let me have more mana at my opening hand if I get them then than I would otherwise. They represent 2 mana. Although not mana ramp, it does more mana in hand than I would have. It's like having another land in hand. Although it does have a loss of tempo attached to it. Then we have my Temples. Another cards that I love having early in the game because I can try to hit that next land drop so I don't miss something. Or, dig a little deeper for the thing I just need. And I love these full arts. They're not the best cards of all time, but I really love them. Next, we have Painlands, Sulphur Springs, Battlefield Forge, and Caves of Quilios. Usually, I only have to ping myself with the first one that gets dropped 1 time or twice at most, and then after that, I just use them for the colorless, especially in a deck like this, where 90% of the mana I've ever casted in this deck is going to be colorless because of the number of equipments I have, or the fact that Sir Gwyn has 3 colorless, along with the Mardu casting costs. Then we've got my 3 check lanes, Clifftop Retreat, Dragon Skull Summit, and Isolated Chapel. These cards, generally, because of the number of dual lands and a few basic lands I have, these generally are just dual lands with the land type, and just really good for all 3-color decks. Next, we've got the 3 dual lands, all super fake, but just as effective at tapping for mana. Then we have 3 fetch lands, letting me go search for those dual lands in order to make sure that those check lands come into play untapped. Next, we've got some taps for any of the colors that I care about lands. Path of the Ancestor has a little bit of extra additional upside here because it does scry 1 if I cast a night spell or a human spell. And, I often have to have no choice but to recast Sir Gwyn at some point because she does draw removal, usually before I can equip her. And if that happens, that scry can be half as good as a draw sometimes. Then we have Nomad Outpost and Tournament Grounds. Both have some sort of downside. Nomad comes into play tapped. I don't have a whole lot of come to play tapped lands here, maybe a total of 6 or so. And but this one taps for all my colors, and the art is very really thematic with my deck. And then Tournament Grounds, of course, being ultimately thematic because it came in the same deck as Sir Gwyn, and it lets me cast Knights or equipment spells with that Mardu colors. It doesn't help that much because my equipment tends to cost colorless mana only, because I don't play any colored artifacts in this deck. And then Sir Gwyn, this is where I can cast my Knights or Sir Gwyn with the deck, with the mana. And then lastly, we've got 3 cards that tap for any color that I need. Exotic Orchard doesn't so much, but it generally taps for at least 2 of the colors. And then Savai Triumph, I know it says that we can cycle it for 3 mana, but I've never done it. But the idea that I could do it excites me. But mostly what excites me is how amazing and how pretty these cards are. It's just yet another way to make my deck look even more presentable and even more fun. I feel like when I have pretty versions of pretty cards in the deck, it just makes it even more fun to play, even more fun to show off. So especially boring things like lands, when you can pimp out your lands, that's fantastic. At some point I need to pimp out the command tower. I haven't got enough of the full art ones yet. And then we'll end this video with the equipments, and these ones I chose to run. So, first we have Sword of the Animus. Land drops are so important, and I've got a handful of 2 and 3 and 4 drop creatures before Sir Gwyn ever comes out, and I can try to attach Sword of the Animus to them in order to hit my land drops. But it also gives +1/+1, which doesn't help a lot when you're playing a Voltron commander, but dropping a land means that if I have to end up recasting my Sir Gwyn, hopefully if I've swung once with the Sword of Animus, it sort of halves my commander tax, and that's of course good. Next we have 2 hexproof enablers. Champion's Helm and Swiftfoot Boots. Champion Helm only does it if it's a legendary creature, so realistically, it only helps my Sir Gwyn. But that's fine, this is a Voltron deck, that's sort of the point, is everything is going to helping Sir Gwyn in the game. And then Swiftfoot Boots makes it much better than Lightning Greaves in this particular deck, because Hexproof is a lot more reasonable than Shroud when you're trying to equip 30 times a game. Then we have 3 of my life-linking equipment. And that's primarily why they're here, because they have lifelink. Of course, Lockset on Warhammer and Shadowed Spear provide an additional small buff each, and Basilisk Color provides Death Touch. Death Touch doesn't come into play that much because it doesn't really. My commander does not have First Strike and doesn't have a whole lot of opportunity to gain First Strike in any of my equipment, so the Death Touch doesn't come into play that often. Although sometimes I can leave one of my secondary creatures up as a blocker with Death Touch so that my Sir Gwyn can swing more freely. And then, of course, the Shadow Spear ability to give my opponent's permanents, or make them lose Hexproof and Indestructible, can be very, very good late game. Although I haven't really done it, but you can imagine the scenario where that would be good. And then nextly, we have just some equipment to add lots of power. So the first one is the Hammer of Design. This is just absolutely one of the best equipment in the deck. It's one of the top 2 or 3 that I go and get because it gives my my Sir Gwyn very, very important Indestructible, as well as a small power boost and the additional ability to attach an equipment to a creature when it enters the battlefield. Is just yet another way that I can get around my equip cost. Although it doesn't really come into play that much because, unless it's instant speed. If I were to do something instant speed, it could come into play. The biggest thing is Indestructible. And Colossus Hammer is just a goofy Timmy card. Adding +10/+10 is awesome. And it makes it lose flying, although I don't have a whole lot of ways in this deck to give flying. Sir Gwyn usually relies on Menace or giant trample damage to get by. And then Bloodforged Battle Axe is just a crazy fun Timmy card. It's not the most effective equipment. If you were going for effectiveness alone, you probably wouldn't even include Bloodforged Battle Axe. But the idea of getting an additional Battle Axe every time you do damage. I have had my Sir Gwyn suited up with like 16 Battle Axes. And that is just, how do you not play that? If you have a deck that can fit that, or the Colossus Hammer or other one, they're too fun. They don't fit anywhere except for this deck, or this type of deck at least. And, these cards are a reason to build a deck that plays equipment. Next, we've got some double strike enablers. Fire Shrieker and Embercleave. Embercleave does give trample and +1/+1 as well. It's the better of the 2 cards, of course. But if, ideally you get your Sir Gwyn and make it unblockable, or, maybe the Menace comes into play. And then if it gets up to 11 power, double strike means that's a 1-hit kill. So 11 is a very important. With Voltron decks, you have different numbers that are very big differences. The difference between 5 power and 6 power tends to be the same clock, so it doesn't help much. But once you go from 5 to 7, then your clock goes from 4 to 3, and if you can get to 11, then it's from 3 to 2. And, ideally, we'd like to get up to 21, but that's really, really difficult. So the best we can usually hope for is to get to at least 11 power, and then attach one of these double strikers. And then we have a one-shot kill. And so double strike is very difficult. Keyword to get a hold of. I've got these 2 equipment and then the land that does it, and only 1 or 2 other items, including my Kinsbale Cavalier, the creature we saw earlier. But, you know, and all the relevant ways to give double strike, I've put them in the deck. And then next we have 2 more equipment. First, O Naginata. O Naginata can only be attached to a creature with power 3 or greater, which means that most relevantly it can attach to my Sir Gwyn. But adding +3/+0 and trample for a very, very cheap 1 casting cost is just very efficient. And trample is another keyword along with double strike that we really, really want to have, because my Sir Gwyn often is giant, but if they can chump block all day, then, you know, that's just, of course, not a good thing. Then we have Haunted Cloak, which gives, most relevantly, gives haste. I would ideally like for the equipment to have a low converted mana cost and a high equip, because I don't really care about the equip. However, this one, it makes the cut because haste is so important. And my commander already has vigilance, but trample, again, very important. And then lastly, we have my package of swords. First being Sword of Feast and Famine. Sword of Feast and Famine gives the +2/+2 protection from black and from green. And it says whenever an equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card, and I untap all lands that I control. This is just the best equipment in the deck. Being able to untap my lands basically doubles my mana. You know, it is spread over the 2 main phases, but still doubling my mana is crazy good. The discarding doesn't matter that much, and the protection from black and for green are not the absolute best protection colors to have, but the untap of my lands just alone makes it the best equipment in the deck. We really hope to be able to double up these protections as well. And then Sword of Fire and Ice is the second best probably equipment in the deck, or at least the second best sword in the deck, and that is protection from blue and from red. Also gives +2/+2, and it says whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, it deals 2 damage to target creature, and I draw a card. So this is just yet another very, very important card draw. And that little bit additional damage sometimes can get rid of tiny utility creatures that I can't force them to block with. And this sort of takes place of an additional kill spell sometimes. Or throwing that damage at somebody's face, although it's not quite relevant because I'm trying to kill with commander damage. Sometimes I just kill with regular damage before the commander damage ever comes into play. But often it's simultaneous. Next we have Sword of Light and Shadow. Gives protection from black and white. So this has the best protection colors, because black and white tend to be the most common kill my creature colors. And getting protection from black and white makes this card very good. And it really means that the other part of the card, whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, I gain 3 life, and I may return up to 1 creature card from my graveyard to my hand. You know, the creature card from my graveyard is not that important. The gaining 3 life is not good enough to make it play it, but the fact that it gives protection from white and black is the reason that this card is still in the deck. At one point, I had this idea that I would play all 10 of the eventual sort of cycle. However, as they got printed, I noticed that some of them weren't quite good enough. So Sword of Sin and Steel gives my creature protection from black and from red, and it says whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, I destroy up to 1 target planeswalker and up to 1 target artifact. I don't play against a lot of planeswalkers, so it doesn't come to play very often. However, destroying very, very important artifacts can be effective, and protection from black and red is pretty relevant. Next, we have Sword of Truth and Justice. This gives protection from white and blue. Protection from white can be the most important of all the protection colors, because it protects me from Swords of Plowshares and things like that. Things that really set me back because they're so efficient and it doesn't slow my opponent down having to cast them. But also, when it deals combat damage to a player, I put a 1/1 counter on that creature, and then I proliferate. So it basically gives, after damage has been done, it gives my Sir Gwyn 2 additional power. And if this alone, it gives her 7. So it usually means that I've put a 3 attack clock on one player, and then right after that, I've got a 2 attack clock on the other 2 players, maybe even less. It's one of the better sort of in the deck. Then Sword of War and Peace. Sword of War and Peace gives protection from red and from white. 2 very good colors to have protection from. Like I said, white is the most important to have protection from. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it deals damage to equal to the number of cards in that player's hand, and I gain 1 life for each card in my hand. So a little bit of life gain is not bad. A little additional damage is not, it's okay. But sometimes people go completely bonkers with card draw, but have no way to win with it. And when that happens, this gives me a way to kill them. But the biggest thing is it gives protection from white. So, and then we did have the other Modern Horizons 1 equipment in this deck. However, I had to take it out because I thought the ability just wasn't good enough for the deck, and I was starting to get overwhelmed with equipment. And in order to play all of the Sword of cycle, I was going to have to make a choice about eliminating all of my other fun equipment, such as my Colossus Hammer and things like that, and I just can't do that. I just like those cards too well. and they're too fun, and I'm not going to give it up just to have a full sword cycle in this deck. And that's why Sword of Body and Mind is in this deck, and neither is the other Modern Horizons sword, nor the new Sword of Hearth and Home. So because none of those, I think, I don't have a lot of creatures to sacrifice to Hearth and Home, and I have enough protection from white at this point. I don't think it's relevant enough to have to look into it. We'll see when the last few swords get printed, if they are relevant, and if they are, then they'll make this deck too. But for now, I think 19 equipment is a pretty good amount. I think that most equipment decks play somewhere around 15 equipment, and that's probably a pretty safe number. I've done as many as 22, and I think that 19 is probably a good sort of agreeable middle ground. Anyways, that's my Sir Gwyn deck. Thank you for watching, and enjoy.